Hello fellow book nerds! Today I'm reviewing The Maze Runner by James Dashner. It's about a boy named Thomas who is about 16 years old, we're not quite sure. He randomly wakes up one day in an elevator and he doesn't know who he is. All he remembers is his name, which is Thomas. When the elevator opens up, Thomas learns that there are other boys in the same predicament as him. None of the boys can remember anything but their names. They welcome Thomas into what they call the Glade, and they only vaguely explain what's going on. But eventually Thomas finds out that there's a maze surrounding the Glade, and that the doors close every single night, and that the maze moves around. So people have been trying to figure out the maze for a long time, but they can't because the walls move. Once a month, a new boy shows up in the elevator, and once a week, supplies show up. And nobody knows where they come from or who sends them. And every night these things called the grievers come out, and if you're caught outside in the maze at night, you're basically a dead man. The day after Thomas arrives, a girl shows up in the elevator, which has never happened before, and there's never been two people show up within the same month, let alone 2 days. And she has a message with her saying that things are going to change. Alright, that's it for the overview. The rest is going to be filled with spoilers, so if you have not read the book, go away and come back after you have read it so you don't get spoiled. Almost right away, Thomas feels as if he knows Teresa. Even though he doesn't have any of his memories, he can't help but feel like he knew her before he got there. How awesome is the telepathy thing? I was slightly creeped out by it, but I was really excited at the same time. Because this shows that Thomas and Teresa actually did know each other, and that they have a kind of connection that nobody really understands. I really enjoyed Thomas's conversation with Chuck the first night he gets there. He shows a real interest in becoming a runner, even though he's not exactly sure what they do, and he's not quite sure of the stakes. And as time goes on and he learns more about the maze and the grievers, he still wants to be a runner no matter how dangerous it is. Suddenly the glade, the walls, the maze, it all seemed familiar, comfortable. A warmth of calmness spread through his chest, and for the first time since he found himself there, he didn't feel like the Glade was the worst place in the universe. He stilled, felt his eyes widen, his breath stopped for a long moment. What just happened? He thought. What changed? Ironically, the feeling that things would be okay made him slightly uneasy. Not quite understanding how, he knew what he needed to do. He didn't get it. The feeling, the epiphany, was a strange one. Foreign and familiar at the same time, but it felt right. I just remember reading this and thinking, something sketchy here. Thomas is trying to explain his need to be a runner to Chuck, and Chuck just totally shuts him down. Whatever they're doing out there, I want in. You don't even know what you're talking about. Go to sleep. I want to be a runner. You can forget that little thought right now. Don't try to... Thomas. Newbie. My new friend. Forget it. I'll tell Albie tomorrow. Thomas is basically in denial. He has his heart set on being a runner and he doesn't care what anybody says. You're a piece of clunk. Go to sleep. Something out there, it feels familiar. Go to sleep. Chuck isn't taking any of your crap today, Thomas. Then it hit Thomas. He felt like several pieces of a puzzle had been put together. He didn't know what the ultimate picture would be, but his next words almost felt like they were coming from someone else. Chuck, I think I've been here before. I remember at this point thinking that Thomas had already been in the maze, and somehow he had got himself out, and he ended up having his memory wiped again and being put back in, and that's why he's having all these weird deja vu things. Gally. What do I even say about Gally? He's an asshole? I like that as soon as they figure out it's a girl in the box, everybody starts calling dibs. I remember at one point when Thomas said he was looking up at the walls and how he was kind of getting like vertigo, almost like he was looking down into something. For some reason, even though I knew it was not going to turn out that way, I couldn't help but think of like the Demonata series, where Lord Loss's like chessboard, where they get like sucked into it and you can look up into the sky and like see his face up there. Like somehow I was picturing that this entire maze was like shrunk down and there were people watching them, and Thomas was one of them, and that's why when he looked at it he got the sense of like looking down because he used to or something. I don't know, it was just something that popped into my head and I couldn't get rid of it for like half the book. Ben's banishment from the Glade is pretty intense. They have like a rope thing tied around his neck and like a long pole to shove him out into the maze before the door shut. Even though Ben tried to kill Thomas, Thomas is really upset watching him get banished, and he even cries, because being banished is a really serious thing. You are being sentenced to your death, basically. Albie and Minho go out to find the dead griever, and of course it takes them longer than they should, and it's almost time for the doors to close, and Thomas sees them barely struggling, coming along. Minho's dragging Albie, and Thomas does basically the stupidest thing you could do, and he slips out before the doors close, and all three of them are stuck out there. But Thomas is pretty smart, and he hangs out Albie up in the ivy and stuff on the walls, and even though the grievers can climb, he still maneuvers to get them away from Albie before he dies. And Minho just ran away. He's just running around the maze. He's like, screw you, I'm gonna try to survive. But they end up finding each other again in the maze and form a plan to get the grievers to jump off the cliff. And in the morning, they make it back, and everybody's like, what just happened? Because they are the first people to ever survive a night in the maze. I still can't quite figure out what the grievers look like. They're described as both animal and machine, and somehow they're able to like roll into balls and like have their spikes sticking out, and then they just kind of roll at you. I can't quite picture it in my head. Then they form a gathering to talk about Thomas because, as Newt puts it, half the Gladers think he's God, and the other half want to throw him down the box hole and get rid of him. Thomas just basically has to sit there the entire time and not say anything and listen to them argue over what to do with him. And he gets so frustrated that he can't say anything to them, he can't defend himself. And Minho speaks up and says that Thomas should replace him as keeper of the runners. Now, when he said that, I was like, okay, that's cool, but are you sure about that? I would have just nominated him as a runner, because then he would get some experience or something, but he's like, no, keeper of the runners. But he tells him later that, aim high and get a lower score, and that's what happens. He says, I want him as the keeper of the runners. They end up giving him like a probationary running role. And I love how Gally and Minho end up getting into an argument because of this. And believe me, you or nobody else has the slightest clue what it's like to be out there. The only reason you were stung is because you broke the same rule you're blaming Thomas for. That's called hypocrisy. You shuck-faced piece of enough, you said. Defend your proposal and be done with it. This scene made me gain so much more respect for Minho, and it made me hate Gally even more. Because Minho backs Thomas up 100%. He talks about how he completely panicked in the maze and Thomas remained completely cool, and that even though he was the veteran, Thomas was more experienced. And Thomas didn't panic under the pressure and was actually able to save them all. And Gally over there is just being hypocritical, like Minho said. Then Gally announces that he'd kill Thomas or Minho if they ever come near him again, and that he swears he's going to stop Thomas if it's the last thing he ever does. And then he storms out, never to be seen again. That is until he comes back later. Newt was kind of the unsung hero of this book. At the beginning, he kind of started out as Albie's right-hand man, and Albie was considered the leader. But you kind of learn that Newt is really his equal and even sometimes his superior, because Albie doesn't exactly make the right choices all the time. I really like the scene between Chuck and Thomas when Thomas basically promises Chuck that he's going to get him home to his family after Chuck kind of lets Thomas know that he feels really alone and he hopes that there's somebody out in the world still looking for him. And I found this scene very touching because Thomas hasn't known this kid very long, but he still feels very protective over him, almost like a little brother. And at the end, when Chuck dies, Thomas is basically distraught because he promised this kid he would get him out and he couldn't keep that promise. When Albie goes through the changing, he says that they need to protect the maps. And later on, when they're all holed up against the grievers in the homestead, and he's like, oh, I'm going to go check the maps, I knew something was going on right then and there. I knew he wasn't just going to check the maps. Something bad was going to happen to those maps. And I was looking at everybody just like, why do you not notice that something is up here? And then the maps end up being set on fire, and Albie is passed out on the floor, big cut on his head. And nobody suspects him because he has the cut. They're like, oh, someone must have broken, knocked him down. But obviously it was just him protecting himself. I was so happy that they hid the real maps and the ones that Albie burned were just paper, because otherwise they would have been completely screwed. We kind of hear a little bit about the flare, even though we're not sure what it is. It is kind of the reason that they're in this situation. Is anyone else slightly confused on what happens during the changing? Because it kind of tells you, once you get stung, you see things from your past, and on the outside you like end up turning green and like disfigured, but then once you come back from it, you don't really remember your memories that you just regained. Eventually, Thomas finds out that the maze every single day is forming a letter, and those words they later find out is a code for a computer. Float, catch, bleed, death, stiff, and push. What kind of a code is that? Things just really start going downhill once Thomas and Teresa show up. The sun isn't shining anymore, the doors won't close at night now, they're no longer getting supplies sent to them or any more people, and it's now more important than ever to find a way out of the maze before everybody dies. When they're all holed up, all of a sudden Glade comes back out of nowhere because he walked off a long time ago, and he just appears out of nowhere and he's like, oh, they're only going to take one a night. You don't know what's going on with him. Glade is adamant that Thomas is evil because he saw him during the changing. And Ben tries to kill Thomas because he sees him during the changing, and even Albie mentions seeing him after his changing. So we obviously know something is up with Thomas. He's more than just another Glader. But we don't find out exactly what that is until Thomas decides to go through the changing himself to figure out what's going on. I saw that coming, but I was still kind of like, don't do it, because I didn't know if he was going to go crazy like everybody else did after he finished the changing, or if he was going to kind of return to normal. But I wanted him to do it for the fact of being able to get out of the maze and figure out what's going on, but I also was really genuinely worried for him. I think it was pretty clever putting the exit in the cliff, because no one's going to think to look there, because obviously you have to jump off a cliff to find it, and it's a very small square compared to the entire expanse of the cliff. But Minho and Thomas find it by throwing rocks, and we come to find out that him and Teresa actually helped design the maze, and that there is no solution to the maze, that the only way out is actually through the Griever hole in the cliff, and that every Glader is actually really smart and was chosen to be in the Glade for a reason. And that reason was to see how smart they were and if they actually could figure out the maze even though there is no way out. It's like an experiment to see how they survive in these conditions, if they turn on each other, if they actually function well within their own society and build rules. And they come up with a plan to have everybody go at once and jump down, and that's where they're supposed to input the code. Flashbacks to Lost, anybody? What's taking so long? You said they'd turn off when you punched in the code. It won't let us enter the word push. I don't get it. Maybe you should just push that button. And then at the end we get to meet the creators, at least briefly, before we find out that Glade is being controlled by them, and it's the same thing that happened to Albie when he was recovering from being stung by the Griever. Glade is forced to try to kill Thomas, and he throws a knife at him, and Chuck jumps in front of him to save him. Then Thomas flips out and beats the shit out of Glade. I really wasn't the least bit surprised at Chuck's death, but it was really sad. Chuck was basically Thomas's only friend other than maybe Teresa. Thomas was still kind of close to Newt and Minho, but not in the way that he was with Chuck, even though Chuck was quite a bit younger. Chuck was the one to kind of show him around and actually give him information when nobody else would, and they bonded right away. I was a little skeptical when the people came in and saved the Gladers from the creators. We learned from one of the women that the flare was actually caused by solar flares that damaged the ecosystem and caused the disease within the people. And the people of Wicked gathered these children to find the smartest kids that they could and try to get them to be able to figure out the cure for the flare. And in the epilogue, we learned that the rescue was in fact staged and that there is a Group B experiment. And they leave it at that. You have to wait for book 2 to figure out who Group B is and what they're going to do with the rest of the Gladers that survived. The only real problem I had with this book was how repetitive Thomas could be. Basically every time he laughed or he was scared, he talked about, oh, that was the funniest thing I've ever heard in my entire life, at least that I can remember. And then he's like, oh my god, that was scary. I think that's the most scared I've ever been. At least I think so, I'm not exactly sure. I could have done without that every single time. Alright, that's the end of this review. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel like it. There are more reviews coming up, including The Scorch Trials, which is the next book in this series. Goodbye, fellow book nerd!